all of a sudden, you've got rapidly rising sea levels, and I had lived next to the sea in Massachusetts and in California, and had walked through the paths of Venice, and I knew what rising sea levels meant for civilization. And I said, my God, we've got trillions of dollars worth of infrastructure right on coasts around the world, and they're vulnerable.
Hello and welcome to the Great Climate Debate Podcast. I'm Jeffrey DeSena. Today, I had the opportunity to put on record one of the many interesting conversations I have had with John Grant. I met John through Citizens Climate Lobby, and he may be the most passionate climate crusader I know. Definitely the most passionate whom I know of his generation. Our conversation covers a wide path, from his long career in academia, to his personal experiences with the dangers of climate change, to his ambitious goals for sustainability solutions. John and his wife Ruth found their way to Fort Collins about 15 years ago, where John recently was a visiting fellow with Colorado State University's School of Global Environmental Sustainability. In his long career, John has worked in consulting and academia in the fields of corporate strategy, international business, and sustainability. He spent the majority of his career on the faculty of the University of Pittsburgh, where he immediately transitioned after receiving his doctorate of business administration from Harvard Business School. He has collaborated with other researchers and enterprises, as well as led study tours in countries literally around the world, having given presentations in faraway lands such as Singapore, New Zealand, the Czech Republic, and the UK. His global travels continue, and I'm honestly grateful that we've been able to connect while I'm spending a short time in Fort Collins. John is a wealth of knowledge and has a wide range of opinions, solutions, and fears surrounding climate change. Even though our conversation stretched over an hour, it was still not enough, but I won't keep you from his wisdom any longer. I bring you John Grant. John, thanks for coming on the podcast.
My pleasure.
Our listeners will have a little bit of background on who you are and what you've done, but I think we'd all like to hear your story of how you got to Fort Collins and what are some of the highlights in your life thus far.
Well, of course, that could be a long story for someone my age, but let me begin with my departure from the University of Pittsburgh in 1997. I had been a senior faculty there in the corporate strategy area for many years, and I had an opportunity to join an organization in Southern California that I thought was doing good work in the healthcare area. And so Ruth and I headed to Orange County, California. That was the tumultuous period around the .com turn of the century, and there was a lot of excitement, and the internet was exploding, figuratively, but sometimes literally. Our first winter in California was an El Nino winter, and the apartment complex where we were perched about 75 or 80 feet above the bay began to slide into the ocean one night. We didn't realize it until the next morning when a terrorized woman came over and said, I'm moving. The tennis court is almost going down the hill. A few days later, we realized that we had just had a horrendous El Nino experience, and that began to wake me up to notions of climate change and the dramatic impacts that it could be having on Southern California. To kind of fast forward, I realized that during this venture for the next couple of years, we were throwing a huge number of little plastic bottles into the trash. And then in about the year 2000, I was at a self-storage unit, and I noticed some what looked to me to be suspicious activity about 50 yards from us, and it turned out to be some ecological bandits pouring large quantities of some kind of polluted oil down a drain that was going straight to the ocean. We called the police, and when they arrived, they wanted us to point to the bad behavior, and we did, and asked them if we should stay around, and they said, no, you better get out of here. This looks very bad. And so a few months later, we were out of California and back to Colorado, where we had been off and on over the years. And shortly after settling near Boulder, I started going to conferences having to do with climate change and its variations, and was alarmed at what I was learning about the condition of the planet that we were leaving to our children and then first young grandchild. So that's a little bit of an introduction to how we got to Colorado, and then a couple of years later we moved from the Boulder area up to Fort Collins, where I started on the faculty as a visiting professor at Colorado State.
Okay, and you kind of jumped ahead a little bit and started getting into what got you interested in climate change. But before we dive too deeply into that, what were you working on before that? You were at the University of Pittsburgh for many years?
For many years. After I got my doctorate at the Harvard Business School, I began continuing my research and teaching in the MBA program, and through a kind of serendipitous set of circumstances, I was awarded early tenure and began leading the MBA program. And a couple of years later, lo and behold, a couple of faculty members quit, and I found myself deeply involved in the doctoral program, trying to help some very bright students get through their dissertation projects. So, for the next 20 years or so, I was very deeply involved with dozens of doctoral students, as well as teaching MBA and occasionally an undergraduate course.
And for those of us who have not studied MBA or studied business specifically, what goes into a program like that? Or might you be able to share a particularly significant doctoral research project that you remember?
Of course, unlike some faculty members, I was most interested in helping students focus on their own deep interests rather than having them work on projects that were of interest to me, just because I had been immersed, because of these faculty shuffles, into several doctoral committees simultaneously. And one of them involved a guy who's become very successful in the sustainability area, but he wrote his dissertation looking at the organization of major computer activities in Asia. And it led to a concept for totally reorganizing the way big computer systems focus on meeting an evolving market, as Asia was at that time. Another student who's also been a very successful leader in the corporate strategy area studied the process of divestment. There was a rule of thumb in the strategy area that most large-scale divestments occurred because of some kind of poor performance on the part of a subunit or division. And she had some evidence that there were other reasons too associated with portfolio considerations. Lo and behold, she did such an outstanding job that she won a big national award for the outstanding dissertation. All of a sudden, that brought a lot more attention to what was going on in the area at the University of Pittsburgh. And there are other examples, but that gives you a feel for kind of what was happening in the early 1980s.
Okay, perfect. You mentioned a little bit about that divestment project, and I suppose my only experience with divestment is from an ethical perspective, particularly toward fossil fuels or operations that
Sure.
people
That's
so
been
much
a
of fan
big
of.
part of the use of the word for the last 15 or 20 years.
And was it not that way beforehand?
No. At the time she was doing her research, there was a great deal of conglomerate activity that was basically associated with buying and selling smaller companies by larger companies. But given the way, the strategy concepts were being used, the operating businesses were connected to cash flow concepts and internal and external financing. And so some of these acquisitions turned out to have such voracious cash demands in order to develop them fast enough for an evolving market that it was more profitable to sell the growing businesses rather than to try to finance them internally. And so this shed a whole new light on the role that corporate headquarters could play in the future of these businesses that were being purchased and sold by the multi-billion-dollar conglomerates.
Mm-hmm. And when you were teaching, what kind of ethical considerations were being brought into business management or business studies?
Well, there was relatively little concern of that directly. The way our school was organized, there was a separate unit of the business school that was at the time called Business and Society, that was kind of focused on these kinds of regulatory and ethical issues. And the area that I was involved with strategy and planning and control systems, we sort of focused on areas of discretionary behavior within sort of these loose boundaries of ethical and regulatory constraints. One of the examples that came up during a discussion of when I had an executive in at one of my MBA classes was that he was talking about an experience he'd had a few years earlier where they had acquired another multi-unit company that was in an industry that he knew was terribly unethical and in just about every way. And he said his number one objective after buying the holding company was to get rid of that division and any legal or ethical issues that might be associated with it. But it had nothing to do with climate change or greenhouse gases or anything. It was more like the general problem in the Rust Belt of the United States, in which the preoccupation during the 1970s when I arrived was with cleaning up the rivers from oil and related chemicals and cleaning the particulate out of the air. And nobody talked about greenhouse gases or CO2 or CH4 going into the atmosphere.
You weren't only teaching or doing research, but you also had some other consulting endeavors as well?
Well, yes, I was involved, like many business school faculty members, in corporate consulting and executive training and things of that nature, which led to further mental or cognitive dissonance between what we were teaching in the classroom and what I saw was going on with some of these big companies, primarily around the Pittsburgh area, but we had many Fortune 500 companies headquartered at the time. One of the sad stories that eventually unfolded was an experience I had with one of my executive MBA students from the UK who was working for a very large oil company, and when he graduated, he went and re-immersed himself in it. He had a PhD in some kind of petroleum engineering or chemical engineering, and he did some arithmetic and reported to the Treasurer's Department that their oil company would be worth twice as much if it were broken up into small pieces and auctioned off, as opposed to operating the way they were operating. And as an example, one of the examples of gross misdirection in that company at the time was that near the beginning of each year, one of the vice presidents, who was opposed to paying property taxes, asked his secretary to be sure to start planning his schedule so he would be outside of Pittsburgh more than 50% of the time, because he didn't want to pay local taxes, even though he was making a high six-figure salary. And he further prided himself, after being in the job for several years, that he had never wasted his time having his chauffeur drive him out to the R&D lab, which was 10 miles away. He always had them bring the R&D projects to the corporate headquarters downtown. This same corporation, after they'd had a small attack on their corporate headquarters, installed a control system that made it more efficient to FedEx packages through Memphis, Tennessee, if they wanted to go more than 2 floors away from their office in the building. So many packages every night went to Memphis and then came back to the same building the next morning to get through the security system. So it was an interesting time, but the transaction costs were often very large.
Well, that's a sad example of corporate malfeasance and just, I guess, egocentrism. But I'm sure you've had many great students, many great partners that you've been with in consulting who have been a little more ethical, upstanding than that. And have you seen the industry change at all? Have you seen business change over your career for better or for worse in that aspect?
Well, it's hard to make generalized statements given what appears in the general press, but certainly in the general arena where we're eventually going to get with regard to ecological issues and so forth, beginning in the 1990s, there were enough faculty members who were beginning to get very concerned about ecological factors that an organization was formed through the Academy of Management called the Division for the Study of the Organization and the Natural Environment. Mm-hmm. And that began to focus attention more directly. They didn't get formally organized, I don't think, until the middle of the 1990s, but discussions started in the late 1980s, and since then, hundreds of people have joined this part of the organization, but it's a tiny slice of the faculty member cadre of, around the world, hundreds of thousands of faculty members. There is a huge push and an increasing recognition that there are both great opportunities for business as well as incredible hazards. As an example, circumstances have been so naive that I encountered an engineer from Pittsburgh here in Fort Collins about 4 years ago who admitted that he had helped design a big factory in western Pennsylvania during the 1980s. They paid absolutely no attention to the carbon dioxide coming out of the chimneys. And as a matter of fact, when they ran their ad announcing the opening of the factory, they bragged about the fact that one of the outputs from this energy-intensive business was carbon dioxide that nobody could see, and along with product and payroll and so forth, they were spending money bragging about one of the very significant externalities, negative externalities from their factory. But he didn't recognize it until a decade after the factory had been opened.
In your experience with your colleagues in research or in business, did you get a sense of the balance of politics? I mean, were people outspoken about their own political views? Could you get a sense of, were people leaning left or right, or was that not really even a consideration?
I would say a tangential, probably a trivial consideration, because that was the era when the intersection of corporate strategy and capital markets was very intense, and there was a lot of focus on shareholder value. And yes, given Pittsburgh's history, there was concern about the role of unions and so forth, but it was a generally buoyant time. And the wake-up call that we had during the 1970s that was sort of disregarded, of course, was the oil embargoes from the Middle East, which led to huge dislocations because of the speed limits that were imposed, the rationing of fuel for automobiles and stuff, that people were doing, crazy things, but the situation passed fast enough that we didn't really focus very much on the structural implications of what had happened. It was just a series of a couple of bad events that led to the redesign of automobile gas caps and a little bit of concern with mileage and so forth. But it passed so quickly, and then I was in Switzerland for the 82-83 academic year, and by the time I got back and resettled with the family and so forth. The picture had changed again by the mid-1980s, and I was asleep at the switch for the last decade that I was supposedly helping people with doctoral students without actually understanding the ecological soup that we were all getting into.
Mm-hmm. So had you learned much about climate change? Were you familiar with what was going on before the event you mentioned in Orange County?
You could say no. I could probably imagine a couple of trivial examples, but it was not until after 9/11 and my sort of shocking recovery of a few weeks after that, and my beginning to, for a short while, had a consulting office in Boulder and began to interact with atmospheric scientists and so forth from the University of Colorado and the atmospheric labs around Boulder, that I had this oh my God moment, or series of moments really, where I would come home and tell Ruth, here's what I heard at this conference today. What if this is true? And then the real wake-up call came, I don't know, maybe in '02 or '03 when I was attending one of these gatherings, and a senior professor from Australia had been for several years on leave at the National Oceanographic and Atmospheric Administration. And after an IPCC report, there was a panel that was being led by one of these section leaders, and 4 or 5 of them reported, and he was the last one to stand up, and he said, I hate to tell you 100 people in the audience, but all of these people on the panel have just told you the optimistic scenarios about what lies ahead. I'm going to tell you about the other half of the distribution of these scenarios that are a whole hell of a lot worse than what they've been talking about. And he put his giant slide up there with his probability distributions, and it was another, good God, could this be true? And of course it was. It's just that nobody wanted to talk about the reality of the downside to what greenhouse gases were doing.
What were some of the things that really startled you in his predictions or in what you had been learning?
He discussed a little bit about tipping points, which ironically is another discussion this week as we talk. What if the permafrost begins to thaw and you get a feedback or feed-forward cycle that goes from bad to worse, and all of a sudden you've got rapidly rising sea levels? And I had lived next to the sea in Massachusetts and in California and had walked through the paths of Venice, and I knew what rising sea levels meant for civilization. And I said, my God, we've got trillions of dollars worth of infrastructure right on coasts around the world, and they're vulnerable. And of course, I'd been in and out of airports in Boston and the San Francisco area, and those airports are going to be underwater. Believe me, it got my attention.
Around that time was when you first came to CSU and you started teaching here in the business school. Did you bring any of that knowledge into your teaching or your research?
Oh, yes. I was delighted to have a chance to get back in the classroom and to begin to repair some of the damage that I had done in Pennsylvania by teaching and not talking about these things during the last decade of my career, when I should have been very aware of this stuff, because Dr. Hansen had made his presentation to the U.S. Congress, and of course in recent years we've learned that the senior levels of the U.S. government knew about the dangers of greenhouse gases 30 years before Dr. Hansen testified before Congress. But I fortunately had a dean at the business school at CSU who was very receptive to these notions of both ethical concerns about business, as well as he had a background in chemistry, and he knew by that time very well what was going on. But the vast majority of faculty members did not.
Did you ever, I don't know, butt heads with some of your colleagues over the issue?
Well, I was a visiting faculty member, and I wasn't sure how long I was going to be there, so I wasn't on any kind of a crusade. However, the dean had had some discussions with a very wealthy individual who was concerned about the role of business in society, and we eventually, during the 2 or 3 years that I was actively involved, developed the GSSE program for sustainability and social enterprise. So there was a very positive outcome. That has become the kind of program that I think 90% of the MBA programs in the country ought to be. There ought to be a required course in atmospheric sciences and the carbon cycle, in addition to much more aggressive intercultural training as part of these programs, because I hate to say it, but lots and lots of MBA graduates still to this day don't have anything like the kind of mental framing that is really required to deal with the multi-trillion-dollar business challenges that we're immersed in right now.
That makes sense. CSU has labeled itself as a very green university and has been known that way. But you've also taught and worked around the world. Have you noticed real significant differences between the way we talk about climate change in the US versus Europe versus Asia, where you've been?
The struggles are the same in the sense that I've corresponded with faculty in China and, of course, had a real awakening experience a couple of times and trips with students to Beijing and Shanghai and so forth. But they're much more willing to talk about chemistry and biology of the atmosphere than they are willing to talk about human rights, because there's only so much that, who's responsible for the atmosphere kind of question versus some very explicit comments about who's responsible for what goes on in the factory. The frustrations in parts of Indonesia where, I spent 3 weeks or so a couple of years ago. Conditions are mind-boggling. I've got pictures on my phone of skyscrapers being built for wealthy people from different parts of the world, primarily very wealthy people from Asia. But 10% of Jakarta is already living below sea level. And one earthquake, followed by a tsunami, could endanger the lives of between 1 and 2 million people in Jakarta in 2 hours, because they're already living below sea level. The water has just got to come over the barrier, and it's going to be a desperate condition. Fortunately, our grandkids were associated with a highly protected part of Jakarta, but it's amazing. And I've been working for the last few months with an author in Germany who's struggling with the same kinds of problems in many parts of Europe, because there's a bit of an acknowledgement, there's a lot of finger pointing, but there are relatively few people who are willing, in spite of the fact that there are big global organizations now focusing on sustainability accounting and so on and so forth. There's still a tiny percentage of what needs to be addressed.
Mm-hmm. You recently referred me to the book Don't Even Think About It by George Marshall, which proposes a handful of ideas out of psychology and social psychology to explain why it is so hard for people to understand the problem, to talk about the problem. Why do you think there is such a limitation on just being able to talk about climate change? Do you think people just don't want to take responsibility? Do they not understand the issues? Or what's your opinion?
Well, of course, there are many causes. I like to, begin the discussion with reference to a book by a fairly famous popular author, Mackenzie Funk, entitled Windfall, that was published about 4 years ago, in which he describes all of the economic winners from climate-related disasters. And these run the gamut from coastal civil engineers who see markets of hundreds of billions of dollars because everything on the coast is going to have to be moved. As an example of his foresight, I was looking at a story recently of a woman who's been trying to sell a coastal house on the eastern part of the United States. She cut the price 11 times over 3 years and then bulldozed it because the awareness of sea level rise risk to her house was building faster than she could cut the price. So she finally said, well, I'm not going any lower, just bulldoze it. The marine attorneys cannot wait for one more little island country to go underwater. Where are the 10,000 members of this country from the South Pacific going to go? To Australia, South America, California? Who knows? Where are their next passports going to be issued? Their country is gone. Can you have a country that's only known by GPS coordinates? Fantastic billable hours. Where do you send the royalty checks? Where's the government in exile? I started getting immersed in this when I wrote a paper more than a decade ago about green GDP calculations taking place in China at the time. Their analysts were concerned that the water was getting bad, the air was getting bad, the land was being depleted, and people said, are we really making progress at 7% GDP a year? And the answer was no. By about 2005, they had concluded that there was zero ecological, economic progress in China for the prior 30 years. Everything that had been stacked up in gold and US dollars was offset by destruction of rivers, atmosphere. In 2007, when I was there with students, our hosts were saying, things are going crazy. The government has quietly said that we're not going to build any more permanent buildings in Beijing because of sea level rise. And I said, what do you mean? What's a permanent building? And they said, well, that of course means one that's going to last more than 500 years. Within a year and a half, the government had shut down the Green GDP agency, and they're only now, in 2018, reappearing about a decade later, because the current leadership of China knows that things are still very bad. They've been so insensitive. When we were there, the local bad joke was that a highly polluting factory had been moved out of Beijing in preparation for the Olympics. But there'd been so little consideration, they moved it to the wrong side of town. And they reconstructed it and discovered that they were upwind from the prevailing wind. So every time the wind blew, they had to shut down the factory because the pollution was just being blown right back into town. It's not intended to be critical of the Chinese. They've been there, doing wonderful, great things for 5,000 years. But it's an example of quick decision under chaotic conditions. The Olympics are coming. We've got to solve the air problem. Do something. And in this case, it was a multi-million-dollar mistake.
Mm-hmm. So you think maybe it's just a matter of ignorance, that the information just isn't in front of people enough?
People are all along the spectrum of concern about Marshall's predisposition. I saw an interesting piece of research from Taiwan recently about the balance between fear and hope with different people. And in this particular study, they said for motivating people, and admittedly these were mostly adults in Taiwan, that the best motivation seemed to come from short-term hope, long-term fear. So, if you can get out of a paralyzed mental state and take action, you can accomplish some positive things. And of course, one can develop various religious analogs or metaphors for, this kind of, communication. It's as basic in the minds of some neuroscientists as, our fight or flight concerns. We don't want to be paralyzed, so we don't want to think about ominous issues. I've got a very good friend who's partially retired psychiatrist who, when I started talking with him about 6 or 7 years ago, he was ready to invest, along with his family members, a substantial amount of money in coastal real estate in the United States. And after 6 months of discussion and a lot of reading on his part, he said, "John, we're not going to do that. The better investment in real estate is back away from the coast, not on the coastline." And so it's trillions of dollars worth of real estate value are shifting every year around the globe. It's just a willingness. Some people want to lie, like a woman I sat next to on an airplane about 4 years ago who was from Florida, and we were talking about things, and she said, "John, I just hope I find some dumb person from California or New York who will buy our house before we have water in the basement, because we're right on the coast of Florida, and until 2 years ago, I thought we were in a fantastic place. But I know it's a disaster just waiting to happen." And of course, since then, Florida has had 3 or 4 hurricanes, one of which put 12 inches of water into the lower level of my good friend's house in St. Augustine. And the next year, he got half that much water into the lower level of his very fancy, architecturally designed house, and 70% of his neighbors are gone because they don't know if their land has any value or not.
Well, obviously, you're not paralyzed by this long-term fear, and you've described to me some rather apocalyptic scenarios for our possible futures. But why are you so concerned about it, and what drives you to attack this problem and continue working on it late in your career or past your career, however you want to define it?
Many years ago, I read part of a book titled Passages, and the different roles that people who have a little flexibility and ability should engage in through their life, if it's a long life. Mine is now over 75 years. I'm in sort of the legacy phase where I'm trying to do things for posterity. And since I've had grandchildren over the last 18, 19 years, that has sort of coincided with my rising awareness and preoccupation with climate change risks and opportunities. So, in many respects, I'm working on behalf of posterity, and that includes grandchildren, but there are hundreds of millions of other people who have grandchildren who have not had the sort of exposure that I have in the last, say, 20 years or so. So this is kind of the best thing I can do at this stage in my life, I would say.
So what specifically are you trying to do in addressing the challenge?
Well, I'm trying to find leverage points with people and organizations that are interested in doing the right thing or wondering what the right thing is, where I can maybe give them some insights or put them in contact with other people or somehow or other help them choose which door to open. Very similar to the experience that, a handful of us had in the business school at CSU when we started the Global Social and Sustainable Enterprise Program.
Is there anyone that you find it hard to talk to about this? It seems like you've been very active in trying to put yourself out there. And have you run into any roadblocks or run into any difficult people to talk to whom you think it's necessary to talk to?
Of course. The summer of 2008, I had a couple of at that time, relatively good friends, one of whom has died in the meantime. They had a view of the economic system that was very different from mine. and that was election year and so on and so forth. We began to have various discussions and so on and so forth, and a series of events occurred in which both of them, within 6 weeks of one another, said, "John, I hate to say it, but I think you're probably on the right side of the argument." And they ended up voting for different people, or at least they told me they'd voted for different people than they originally thought they were going to vote for. I've got a good friend who's within walking distance of where we're sitting right now, who is an obstinate denier. He's a very smart guy, semi-retired, extremely prosperous, but he just doesn't want to hear for whatever reason. I would like to ask him what kind of carbon offset he buys each year for his very extensive retirement travels, because he ought to be paying thousands of dollars a year in carbon offsets to some charitable organization. But I would bet 90 to 1 that he's not.
Have you tried to have a conversation with him and about the topic, and where does it go? Does it go anywhere?
It basically doesn't go anywhere. And he's got a couple of family members who've also tried to have the conversation with him, but to no avail. And I know that effort has been going on for many years, because if one thinks about the writings of Joshua Green and his moral tribes notions, I'm afraid that many people have gotten themselves into social psychological situations where it's unbelievable to them what's going on. I've got a very good friend who's a semi-retired Air Force guy who lives down near the Air Force Academy. He's got 6 people that he can talk to in his friendship group about the reality of what's going on, even though the Air Force is spending tens of millions of dollars a year on windmills and solar farms and all kinds of stuff to try to address renewable energy and climate change. And they're working with Boeing to the tune of at least hundreds of millions of dollars, redesigning refueling jets and so forth. I've got another friend down there who is a very distant relative and a former faculty member at the Air Force Academy. He's living in a compartmentalized life. He respects the Air Force, but he can't deal with what they're doing, even though the windmills are literally right in front of his face. And I don't know, maybe the solar panels are reflecting off his house. It's just truly amazing, but he's got this tribal affiliation with deniers that spills over into all kinds of other political, kinds of issues. And, one of the best examples that you and I have talked about very briefly before is a couple of my good friends in Oklahoma who have exactly opposite views of wind farm and wind energy and so forth. Both of them longtime residents of the northern part of Oklahoma. One of them thinks wind farms are the greatest saving grace for his ranch, and the other one thinks they're an abomination to the landscape. And they may both die hanging on to their brass rings.
Well, I hope I can find my way into some of these social circles and understand what it's like to be on the inside there. But yes, it does seem like there's this cognitive dissonance, especially in military environments, and the Department of Defense has labeled climate change as a threat multiplier.
Yes.
So it seems interesting, but hopefully I'll be able to dig in a little deeper with someone who is actually involved in that community. But speaking of affiliations, you and I were discussing yesterday a white paper that you had been reading through, and you expressed some skepticism over one of the authors of that white paper, and I guess my question was, what raises your skepticism about people who might be discussing climate change or potential solutions to climate change, and what might be undermining your trust of what they're after?
Most of us are aware that tens of millions of dollars have been spent over the last 20 or 30 years in a systematic effort to procrastinate and delay public recognition of the significance, greenhouse gases, climate change, and the consequences for civilization. And a lot of this, of course, is circled around the fossil fuel industry. But the particular author that you mentioned had spent much of his career at a high level with an European-based petrochemical company. And he may have seen the light and may be a 100% honest, legitimate person. On the other hand, he might have a multi-million-dollar portfolio of fossil fuels that still have significant economic value. And this particular report that I referred to, and the other half of my comment was that the report of 10 or 15 pages was written in a way to obfuscate any effective communication. I think that was accidental because he was one of 3 or 4 authors. But the cynical side of my life says I'd want to know exactly, I'd like to try to find out from the other 2 co-authors what this guy's real role in the preparation of this draft document was. Was he really on the cutting edge of the best thinking in the paper, or were a couple of these ridiculous examples that were stirred into the document his contributions that would just undermine the effectiveness of the overall communication?
Do you find yourself defaulting to skepticism or trusting authors on such documents that you read?
I try to be very cautious. Where did they come from? What of this are they apt to know from formal education or from life experiences or from family views? You and I may or may not have talked in the last couple of years about some study that I read, say, a year and a half or so ago, about the views of climate change in the future in relationship to whether or not adults had children and or grandchildren. And frankly, I was shocked that there appeared to be no difference between the 2 groups. My working hypothesis would have been that the adults with children and or grandchildren would have been much more concerned than those without in general. But that did not seem to be the case. Someday I may get back into that subject more deeply and try to really understand some of the nuances, whether they're cultural or geographic or financially contingent. I'm not just sure. But there are clearly lots and lots of people in the world who are so wealthy that they can retreat to higher and higher ground, if you will. And of course, one of the great paradoxes of Colorado is that many of the people who fly their private jets into the Aspen airport are destroying the atmosphere and undermining the value of their condos with every trip that they make. But that's what they choose to do, just like my psychiatrist friend who's got a good friend in Miami. And he knows that climate change is cutting the value of his house $10,000 a year. But he says, hey, I'm old. My grandkids like to come here and use the swimming pool. And so it's a few $1,000s a year. I don't expect to live forever. So the people are all over the place, with regard to George Marshall's 40 different perspectives on denial. How much of it is neurologically based, how much of it is sociology, how much of it is economics. In total, it's a huge problem among not the population generally, but among the decision makers who are deciding about big investments in infrastructure and so forth on behalf of taxpayers and so forth.
Speaking of investing in large projects, you pitched a question to me yesterday, and I thought I'd turn it around on you to hear your thoughts. If, say, some wealthy philanthropist were to approach you tomorrow and say, John, I think you have the right idea here, I think your heart's in the right place, and I think you're the right guy to really make the most of some money if I'm going to invest it. They offered you, say, $100 million to make the most of what you could. It's not enough to totally transform the energy system or to buy out a media conglomerate, but it's a good amount of money. What would you do with that?
One of the things that I would immediately begin doing is focusing on, and let's pretend that this amount of money was going to be made available over a 3 to 5 year period. So some kind of rationality could go into it, but at the same time, a great sense of urgency. I might convene a group of people in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, to look at some of the sites that I visited in July of this year, starting with the Falk School of Sustainability in Chatham University, which is about a 400-acre piece of land that has now had $10 or $12 million worth of buildings and solar panels and dormitories and so forth built as an ecosystem for rapid learning about these situations. And I would look for partners. What foundations are interested in rapid scaling up so civilization doesn't face what I fear might be complete chaos in 5 years from now, maybe 10 years. As I've told you before, a few years ago, I listened to Dr. James Hansen in Denver speak before a group of 300 people who said basically that he probably wouldn't see it because he's the same age I am, but his grandchildren are facing a situation that's going to be as bad as World War II plus the Great Depression occurring simultaneously. I think that's very, very bad, although I do fear that hundreds of millions of people are going to die during this transition. But going back to your immediate question, find positive models, and there are thousands of them around the world. But I would focus on the greenhouse gas solutions, one of which is currently aggressively being funded by the Environmental Defense Fund under the leadership of Fred Krupp, and just recently was co-underwritten by the state of California, and the governor put an $80 million satellite to begin posting on the internet methane leaks around the globe so that action can be taken. Okay, that's 4 years from now. That's too long for certain kinds of action, but it's stage setting. What would you do if you were a mechanical and civil engineer and knew that 4 years from now you were going to have access to all of the major leaks in natural gas pipelines around the world? Well, there are people who make these fixes every day, but that market has got to be 10 times bigger. So there's a business opportunity. Gear yourself up, learn, make contacts, and so forth. That's not for me to do. That's for somebody with your kind of skills in your generation who's interested in commercializing the capture, because it's estimated by EDF that 50% of these leaks are self-financing. In other words, if you just put on the equivalent of high-performance duct tape on these leaks, you'd save enough gas to pay for the cost of the fix. These problems are so phenomenal. One of my good friends at CSU is a satellite greenhouse gas monitoring guru, and a couple of years ago, his satellite record showed a huge spike in CO2. And when he was recounting the analysis, he said, "John, it looked like the equipment had broken. There was such a massive concentration of CO2. And so he and some colleagues went back through their records to see where the satellite was when they got that huge blip. And much to their relief in terms of the equipment, the satellite had been right over the top of a gigantic coal-fired power plant in Asia, and had just gotten a complete dose of this CO2. So there's tremendous precision in this satellite data collection process, but you've got to have an enforcer and a fixer on the ground. Okay, that's one path. So educational systems. I would like to replicate this false school of sustainability. First, 10 times in the United States, as soon as possible, coast to coast. Different climates, all sorts of different configurations, some smaller, some bigger perhaps, but do that and then figure out where, and simultaneously develop collaborating institutions, could move on some of these things. What are you going to do? I'd have an urban group working on Boston, Jakarta, Shanghai, Venice. I mean, the tragedy of Venice this week. The tourists are having fun playing in the water up to their knees, and lots of the residents are crying because this is not a vacation play in the pool. This is the dreadful reality. They didn't raise the sidewalks high enough. They should have raised them 24 inches instead of just 12 inches. Same thing that's going on in Miami. So, getting collaborators from the Rocky Mountain Institute, there are other places. There are, huge activities going on at the Tyndall Institute in the UK, the Stockholm Resilience Center in Sweden. There are lots and lots of these places that I would get together and leverage, because the world needs to redirect trillions of dollars, not millions or billions, but trillions of dollars over the next decade in order to do some mitigation, some remediation, and to avoid the kind of catastrophes that one of my friends in Alaska is witnessing, who's a coastal engineer, where villages are literally falling into the ocean on the coasts where the Inuits have been living off the sea for hundreds, maybe thousands of years. Their cemeteries and ancestors' graves are going into the ocean. And it costs $100,000 per human being to move them 10 kilometers inland. The arithmetic is staggering. And who is going to win big? The same people who won big when we were building the interstate highway system. Only this time it's not only going to be Caterpillar and John Deere and International Harvester, it's going to be the heavy civil engineering manufacturers from Japan and China and India and Germany, because people are going to be making decisions about hundreds of billions of dollars worth of raising of buildings, moving of dirt, and all kinds of stuff. So it would be easy for me to spend the first $100 million in 3 years getting things ramped up, very similar to what happened at Tuxedo Park on the shore of the Hudson River during the lead up to World War II, where some investors developed a big science lab to develop military capability that the government of the United States was not willing to fund. So this book called Tuxedo Park is one of my inspirations for gearing up and getting ready for the recognition whenever the equivalent of Pearl Harbor occurs. You probably saw in the news in the last day or two of this piece of ice that fell off the Pine Island glacier in Antarctica that's 5 times the size of Manhattan Island. Just crunch, crunch, and all of a sudden you've got a new iceberg that's big enough to build a giant airport on. Well, why did that occur? Well, we don't know. Was it heat from above or heat from below? Those are long-term questions. But right now, we have the knowledge to move on many fronts using some of the preliminary data in this drawdown.org website that Paul Hawkins has put together with dozens of associates with different technological interests. There's tremendous knowledge and great interest, and although there are going to be naysayers and people trying to subvert certain kinds of projects for obvious short-term economic interests, my interest is on preserving civilization and gene pools and as many human beings as possible, but there will be millions and millions who will be lost during this transition.
That doesn't sound like a particularly bright future that I have to look forward to.
Unless you want to get into natural gas pipeline repair.
Yeah, and it also does seem that there is a significant amount of momentum and resistance toward moving on sustainability at all, but that has only seemed to inspire you further. So what gives you hope that all of these efforts are not in vain?
Well, because I know there are a lot of positive examples. I mean, if one takes Michael Bloomberg, for example, and I'm not his advertising agent, but there's an individual who has, admittedly, he's a multi-billionaire, but he has personally, through his philanthropic organizations and so forth, invested hundreds of millions of dollars in helping address/solve slices of the greenhouse gas problem. I'm thinking particularly of his investing money to shut down some of the worst coal-fired power plants. But we need 100 times 300 million to focus on this issue. The work that's being done on solar panels. I mean, the progress that has been made. When I moved to Colorado about 18 years ago, it took about 20 years for a solar panel to save enough energy to pay for the energy that went into the construction of the solar panel. So it was about a net zero. But now, according to the NREL lab down in Golden, it's down to between 4 and 5 years. So we're not talking about the nominal cash return. We're talking about the net carbon footprint. So when you get to the year 6 with current high-performance solar panels, you're honest to God generating energy with a negative carbon footprint. That's happened because of aggressive investment, tremendous R&D, and so forth. And we need to do that with food systems. I mean, I've got discussions in process with people who are heavily involved in the cattle industry. And of course, here in Colorado, you've got to be careful about who you talk to about what kind of animals, because we've got so many of them making so much methane and providing food for so many millions of people that you've got to be careful. I won't go into the story that someone told me during my first year at Colorado State about the many forms of green that exist around the university, but they're in very direct conflict with one another on different sides of the campus. Who wants to generate more methane and who wants to shrink the methane? But that's going on in every university, that has any kind of animal science program going on.
I only got through about half of my questions, but I'm sure that we will continue this conversation. I very much look forward to it. But I want to thank you very much for spending some time with me and sharing your thoughts and your experiences. I look forward to working further with you on what you're doing, and I'm excited for what you have coming up, and I hope I can help spread the word and figure out where you can most amplify your efforts.
Well, I would enjoy having that opportunity. As you know, I got another activity that's just started a few weeks ago that I'm not at liberty to talk about yet, but it involves a very big initiative in Europe where I've developed relationships with some people who share my sense of urgency, and hopefully the shroud will be pulled off some of those things fairly soon. One of them involves a big book project, and another one involves a multilateral group of people who've been working together for decades. I appreciate your work, and I hope that you can develop substantial reach for the kinds of work and interviews that you're doing.
Well, I sure hope so, and we'll stay in touch on that project, and if it goes anywhere, I'll be happy to spread the word. So thank you very much, John. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you, Jeff. I appreciate it.
If you enjoyed this conversation, please subscribe on iTunes, Stitcher, YouTube, or wherever you prefer to get your podcasts. And please share with your friends on social media, or maybe in a real live conversation. If you'd like to know more about John and his ambitions, he has posted plenty of information on his LinkedIn profile, and you can find links to the organizations we talked about in the podcast description. This has been the Great Climate Debate Podcast. I'm Jeffrey DeSena. Thank you for listening.